you, everyone. It is amazing to be here with you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
This is one of those interviews where you just start, wow. I'll try and sum it up my best Terry Gross, which is going to be tough. It's going to be a tough one. We're saying that you've been everywhere with everyone in the last year plus.
What's my first time hanging out with you, Peter?
Our first time hanging out officially. But the funny thing is that we grew up kind of like in shouting distance from each other. We probably heard some of the same drag racing on Woodward Avenue.
Absolutely. Both grew up in Metro Detroit. Yeah.
I know. And what did we else figure out?
We had ice cream together, Ray's ice cream. Any Ray's ice cream fans out there? Amazing ice cream.
We were likely on one of those same long lines together. And between all of our families, we've got MSU and U of M covered, so we're all good there, right? We
go blue and go green,
yeah,
right?
We start off in a good spot. Many of you have read the book, of course. Some of you are reading it, and the rest of you are about to. So I thought it would be a great idea. We both thought it would be a good idea to start with Mona and a passage from the book that she likes to read that basically tells us what the book is going to be about.
Absolutely. This is the story of the most important and emblematic environmental and public health disaster of this young century. More bluntly, it is the story of a government poisoning its own citizens and then lying about it. It is a story about what happens when the very people responsible for keeping us safe care more about money and power than they care about us or our children. The crisis manifested itself in water and in the bodies of the most vulnerable among us, children who drank that water and ate meals cooked with that water, and babies who guzzled bottles of formula mixed with that water. The government tried hard to convince parents the water was safe when it wasn't. But this is also a story about the deeper crises we're facing right now in our country. A breakdown in democracy, the disintegration of critical infrastructure due to inequality and austerity, environmental injustice that disproportionately affects the poor and the Black, the abandonment of our civic responsibility and deep obligations as human beings to care and provide for one another. There are a lot of villains in this story. A disaster of this scale does not happen by accident. I'm going to skip to a good part. For all the villains in the story, there are also everyday heroes, the people of Flint. Just as a child can learn to be resilient, so can a family, a neighborhood, a community, and a city, and so can a country. A country can endure trauma and neglect and become a place where people are cared for, where democracy and equality and opportunity are once again encouraged and advanced, where poverty is silenced instead of people, where we nurture one another and create stable and safe environments for all children to grow up. This is where healing begins.
I hope that tonight we can talk about social justice and children. This is an incredible detective story too. There's so many forms going on throughout this book, right? It's an incredible history as well. A history of your family and your roots and your road here as a person and as a family. So I was hoping that we could start there and ask you about that. Well, first of all, I hope your drive here was less eventful this time.
No car accident, no broken neck.
But you had that one of those moments with a doctor. What were some of those other moments and aha times where you knew I'm gonna be a doctor. I'm gonna help people. I'm gonna be a pediatrician.
Yeah. So this book is is so much more than just about Flint. So it is a fast-paced detective story of what happened in Flint. And Oprah put this book on her summer reading list, and she said it had the gripping intrigue of a Grisham novel. I'm like, that's awesome. So there is that fast-pacedness to it. But there's so much more than that. To understand kind of my role in Flint and what I did and why I do what I do, you have to know who I am. So this book really gets into kind of who I am and how I came to be in Flint and why I went into medicine. And a lot of that, like Dr. Taylor said, it started actually here in Traverse City. So the beginning of the book talks about a car accident. And we lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We lived in Houghton, Michigan. Any Yoopers in the audience? There's some Yoopers. So we lived in the Upper Peninsula. My father was doing his postdoc at Michigan Tech, and we would drive down to Metro Detroit and make that 12-hour drive. And one winter break after the Christmas holiday, we were going back up to the UP, and we were in Gaylord, Michigan, and the car hit that patch of black ice, and I broke my neck, I fractured my jaw, I had multiple surgeries, my teeth were braced together for months, and it was here in Traverse City that I first had an interaction with a physician.
Do you remember who that was?
I have no idea. I wish I knew. I don't even know what hospital it was. Probably Munson, the sponsor. I don't know, but I don't know. But it was, we were scared. We had limited English. I was with my mom. We had immigrated to this country. We didn't, speak English well, and it was this kind doctor. I remember she had dark hair and she had dark skin and she looked like me, and we were scared, and she held my hand and she told me everything was going to be fine. And then, flash forward 30 years from that, I'm that doctor, and I'm in front of that brown girl, and I'm telling her, hey, you were in an accident, and it wasn't your fault, but we're going to make sure that everything is going to be fine.
You still come back to that time.
Absolutely. So it's one of my very early experiences with medicine. And my path to medicine was kind of atypical. I started out my work as an environmental activist. So I was a high school student in Royal Oak, and we had we did everything that high school students do in their environmental clubs. We recycled and we put on play for elementary schools. But there was also a neighboring incinerator in Madison Heights, and that incinerator was located adjacent to an elementary school. Kids in that area had higher asthma rates. And my mentor, the leader of this environmental group, said, let's get involved in a real cause. So as high school students, I was 13, 14 years old, we door knocked and we protested, and we eventually worked with our community hand in hand, and we got that incinerator shut. And I couldn't even drive. My parents would drop us off. And it was amazing. Good luck, don't get arrested, we'll pick you up, in a couple hours. But that was one of my very first kind of flavors of what it means to be an activist, what it means to be an advocate, the intersection of your environment and your health, and how you can make a difference when you raise your voice. So there's many of these pivotal experiences which are in the book that really kind of frame me in terms of how I could best serve my community.
Where'd that fire in your belly come from as a kid to really just get out there and go after it with your comrades?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that we immigrated to this country, so I wasn't born here. I'll show you my birth certificate. So we're going to try to put a little humor in tonight. So we came here when I was 4, so I'm Iraqi-American.
You're born in England.
Born in England. Yeah. My father was doing his PhD in Sheffield, England. And my first language was Arabic. My brother, who's a year older, was born in Baghdad, and the plan was he was going to finish his studies, and we'd go back home to Baghdad. That was home. That's where all my extended family was at the time. It was the late 1970s, and Saddam Hussein was rising in power. You guys remember Saddam Hussein? So my parents were hearing terrible stories and having firsthand, from family members of what his regime was doing. They saw and they feared that rise of fascism in their home country. They saw the effects of oppression and dictatorship, and they had 2 small baby children, and they decided to come to the States. So I was raised with a lens of being every day grateful to be in this country as an immigrant. I was every day lucky. I woke up every day lucky to be in this country for freedom, for opportunity. And that American dream was absolutely realized for me and my family. But my parents did not blind us from what was happening back home.
I was going to ask, how aware were you of that concern about what was happening back in Iraq? It seems like they were able to correspond quite a bit.
Absolutely. So, my father, the scenes in the book where whenever I envision my father as a child, he is back in his back office with a shortwave radio, and he's finely tuning the channels, and all I can hear is static, trying to pick up any noise of what was happening back home. And we would have subscriptions to things like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, trying to see what was happening to their home country and trying to be involved and make others aware of what this dictator was doing. And at that time, he was the friend of the US. And I remember being 11 or 12, and my father, I went back into that office, and smoke-filled office, because he would smoke cigarette after cigarette, fine-tuning that shortwave radio, lots of static. And he showed me a Human Rights Watch article of a baby with her father, both dead on the ground in Halabja, Iraq. And Halabja is the city in northern Iraq in Kurdistan where Saddam Hussein literally poisoned an entire city. It was, to date, the largest chemical weapons attack, 5,000 people they died that day. And that was the first time I ever saw a picture of a dead baby. And it was the pictures in the book, wrapped in a pink blanket, chubby cheeks, nestled by her father. So at that moment, I acutely understood what people in power could do to vulnerable populations. And that was the milieu of my childhood, being that everyday grateful to be here, but also knowing what injustice could be and what people could do to the oppressed. And it is because of kind of that upbringing that I pledged my career to medicine, which I thought that was to be the most intimate form of service, I still do, and to being in places like Flint.
I thought it was interesting. Well, your parents were both scientists. Mm-hmm. Your dad was a metallurgist.
Yeah, I lived like the periodic table. Like my mom's a chemist, my dad's a metallurgist. Like I could tell you everything in the periodic table.
We'll get around to PB.
Yeah, we'll get that
very
PB.
Soon. So how to what extent was their influence early on into the career of medicine?
I think they, like most immigrant families, they want you to be a lawyer or a doctor and go to school and do well. And I mentioned in the book, the religion of my family was education. They both have advanced degrees. My mom was a chemist in Iraq, and there was like 2 women in her chemistry class. My father is this PhD metallurgist. My mom came here and became a teacher. So they knew that education would open doors. We had nothing when we came to this country except our education, and that is what got us this American dream. So I think they wanted me to serve. They wanted me to really, no matter where I was and where I lived and what community I ended up in, the focus was to make that community better.
You take us back to these vivid times and places, especially with your family, and I hope we can touch more on that before we get to social justice and science and a lot of the meat, but this is really the meat of the book too. I love the photo of your mom and the other women who are classmates of hers with kind of the Jackie O era look pictured.
Yeah, there's a picture in the book in the 1970s. My mom is in Babylon, so it's right. in Babylonia.
That's
and
the one.
They're all wearing mini skirts and they have like gorgeous hair, and this is how they grew up in Iraq, and it's very multi-ethnic, diverse community, and that's what they remember.
It's a fantastic slice of history. Who's your friend Elin?
My friend Elin is a high school girlfriend.
Yeah.
We've known each other for 25, 30 years. And we've remained really close, since graduating from high school. And in late August is when Elin really changed my life. So we were having a last-minute barbecue. So I literally texted her a couple hours prior. I'm like, hey, Elin, another friend from high school is coming into town. Are you free? You want to come over, bring the kids? She's like, okay, yeah, I've been free. I'm free, I'll come over. So Elin is a water expert, a drinking water expert, like who knew? She worked at the EPA a decade ago when Washington, D.C. had an even worse lead and water crisis. She had come back home to Metro Detroit to be closer to family, and she was at my house in late August, and we talked.
And a barbecue turned into this thing.
A barbecue changed my life. So she cornered me in my kitchen, and her eyes were like literally boring into my eyes. Yeah. And she's like, Mona, what do you know about the Flint water? And I'm like, it's fine. How can our water not be fine? We're in Michigan. Like, this is the Great Lakes. This is America, the richest country in the history of the world. I mean, of course the water is fine. I was in clinic this week. My parents and my patients, they ask me all the time, is the water okay? And I keep telling them the water's okay. Of course the water's okay. How can our drinking water not be okay? And she continues to stare at me, saying, with this amazing wisdom you could see in her eyes. She was the valedictorian of our high school class, a brilliant girl. And she's like, Mona, the water is not okay. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? She's like, she had seen a memo that was leaked, who was written by her former colleague at the EPA, that said that without the proper treatment, which was missing in the Flint water treatment, there would be lead in the water. And that was the very, very first time I heard the word lead in the water. I'd heard about the color and the odor and the taste issues and the bacteria and the chlorine that was added and all these different things. I was blinded by the reassurance. I was literally drinking the Kool-Aid that the state had said that everything was okay. But when I heard the word lead, there's no going back. When a pediatrician hears the word lead, you don't mess around with it.
I was fascinated by her statement, water treatment is an art form. And that's kind of what you're talking about, that we know about now, the sort of mixture of things that were coming, things that were going, things that were switching. It was all part of a balance that she knew was wrong.
Yeah, so to any water scientist, what happened in Flint didn't make any sense. First of all, you never go from a high quality water source to a lower quality water source, unless maybe you've ran out of that water source. But the Great Lakes is still here, it's not going anywhere. So just that move was a red flag. And then the criminality, or the reason that we have this issue, is because the water wasn't being treated properly. When we switched to the Flint River, even though it wasn't a higher quality water source, it wasn't being treated properly. And I think of it like a medicine that was missing. That's that art that needs to go into it. This medicine called corrosion control was not added to the Flint water treatment. And because of that, it made our water 19 times more corrosive than the water we had been getting from Detroit. And it would have been okay to use, difficult to manage, if it was treated properly.
When you became aware of this through Elin, and you heard the lying continue, how did you feel?
So I think I felt kind of emboldened. Like I said, when a pediatrician hears the word lead, it's a call to action. It's probably the most well-studied neurotoxins known to man. We've known of its evil for really centuries. It impacts everything that a child can become. It impacts cognition. It actually drops IQ levels. It impacts behavior, leads to things like developmental disabilities and ADHD. And it's even been linked to things like opposition disorder and criminality. We also now know about the epigenetics of lead, which is how your environment changes your genetics. We know that moms exposed to lead, you can see those genetic changes in grandchildren. Incredible science has taught us now that there is no safe level of lead. None. Levels we thought were okay decades ago, when we had lead in paint and lead in gasoline, are no longer okay. We have learned a lot. And we also know that lead is a form of environmental racism. It's a form of environmental injustice. Our kids in Flint already had higher lead levels, just like kids in Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia and Baltimore. Some of our country's kind of most vulnerable children everywhere are already burdened with higher rates of lead exposure because of poor housing stock and legacy contamination. And then to add this potential exposure and to have it be denied, there was only moving forward here. In public health and in medicine, we're governed by something called the Precautionary Principle, which means you err on the side of caution. In the field of public health, we talk about primary prevention, which means you're never supposed to expose a population to lead. So even the question of it, the potential of it, should have stopped this crisis.
I was fascinated with the history of lead that you take, as fascinating as that sounds, but it was. Going back to Roman times.
Yeah. So we talked about PB. So do you know where does that come from?
Plumbing.
You got it. So I didn't even know this before this water crisis. So PB is from the Latin plumbum, which means plumbing.
Right.
So lead actually
I only know that because I read it in the book.
Yeah. So lead actually means plumbing. And for years, I had been treating children with lead poisoning, and I never once asked about water as a source of lead exposure. Yet we have been using lead in plumbing since we invented plumbing, because it came from plumbing. So the Romans built their aqueducts out of lead plumbing. And there's actually like real theories that hypothesize the demise of the Romans was because they used so much lead in their plumbing. They also put it in their food and did other crazy things.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy.
As a flavoring.
Yeah, as like salt, like not a good idea. But the history of lead in this nation is unnerving, and there's been so many books written about it, and I had to include it. There's a lot of history in this book, but it's page-turning, like Grisham thriller, history. It's not like go to sleep history, but we have to know this Flint history, and this lead history, and this public health history, and this family history, because we step through complicated systems and places all the time, and we don't know what we're stepping on, and we need to know how that came to be. But the lead history is absolutely evil. So in the early 1900s, most of the world stopped using lead, and that's at the same time we started using more of it because of profits. There's a lot in there about General Motors' use of lead in tetraethyl lead, Kettering, renowned GM engineer, who put lead in gasoline when he knew it was bad, when there was alternatives, but because GM had a patent on it. So there's many, many examples throughout history, especially lead history, where profits have reigned over people and have reigned over children, and they've used a lot of kind of blamed the victim approaches and also racist approaches to keep it in use.
I'm glad that we're kind of shifting into environmental justice a little bit now. And I wanted to ask you, who is Bunyan Bryant?
Yeah. So I told you I had this weird way of getting into medicine. So I started out as this environmental activist, which took me to the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment as an undergrad. So I was a tree-hugging environmentalist in college. And that is where I learned from Bunyan Bryant, who was a professor in that school, about what environmental justice was. So 20 plus years ago, I was learning from really the father in the field about environmental justice, which is the recognition that people who are poor, that people who are minority are disproportionately burdened by environmental contamination. And Flint is the most egregious example of environmental justice in this century, but it is not the first. And it continues to happen throughout this nation. Southwest Detroit, predominantly Hispanic community, has the worst air quality in the state. And there's example after example of environmental justices. And I was fortunate to learn about what that was 20 plus years ago. And in Flint, when this crisis erupted, colleagues would say to me, like, have you heard about this concept named environmental injustice? I'm like, yeah, I actually learned from the legends in the field. And Bunyan Bryant, to make even more serendipity of the story, is a Flint native. He is from Flint. His family is still in Flint. He got involved in the movement of the environmental injustice movement because of what was happening in Flint. He helped file a lawsuit against the EPA. That's a 25-year-old lawsuit where they put a trash burning actually a lead wood chip burning incinerator in a predominantly African-American neighborhood that was settled on Obama's last day of office, where they also said it was a form of environmental injustice. So there's a lot of Flint connections, and Flint has this long history of ongoing environmental injustices, especially with legacy pollution.
So he talked about ways that these ideas were baked into certain people's lives, and then you were able to carry those thoughts into your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So he taught us how to use data and how to use science, how to use zip codes and maps to be able to prove that these things were happening.
Right. It's not radio, so I don't have to re-identify here. I'm speaking with it's just a natural reaction. Sorry. I knew that was going to happen. It's unpreventable.
It's great to be back with you.
Yeah, great to be back with you. I'm speaking with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. This is going to be on radio, so we're good.
Great.
You also have taught and teach the next generation of healthcare providers, and you're an optimist. You've guided a recent class using the Lego movie classic song, "Everything is Awesome." What are you fired up about with the next generation of healthcare providers?
I'm fired up with the next generation. Where are those high school students again? The amazing high school students. So there's a bunch of, there you guys. You guys are awesome. Everybody give them a hand. So when I was writing this book, the audience in my head were students. It was the next generation. And my grandmother was a teacher, my mom was a teacher, and I am a medical educator. So my real job during this crisis was I was a pediatric residency director. So I was training the next generation of pediatricians. When you are in education, like any teacher, your impact is multiplicative. Like I can go out and take great care of children and be an advocate, but when you are instilling that in other folks, it continues for years, if not decades. And I am so hopeful about this coming generation. We see it in these kids. We see it in the Parkland kids. In Flint, we have kids who are leading our recovery. We have a little girl named Little Miss Flint, Mari Kopany. She has done more in her 10 years of life than most adults have done in terms of raising money and raising awareness. So I am so hopeful for the next generation. And just like being a parent, as an educator, your only hope is that they go out and do better than you. And I know that they will go out and do better. And that's what I hope that the message of this book is. Because this message, the book is very much about kind of what happened, but it's also a story of activism and resistance and how to build hope in any community. And that is what our young people are really good at and need to continue doing well.
What has writing the book and talking about the book and seeing the issues in the book move forward and being noticed, doing this, how's it changed your life?
I drink a lot more coffee now, so I used to drink a lot.
You were drinking a lot in the book, so
yeah,
I'm concerned.
It's like IV fluids. Just kidding. So you write a book to share a message, and I have been so privileged to have this microphone, to be able to share a message, and to be able to impact kids way beyond the borders of the city of Flint. And I will continue doing that as long as I have a microphone, because the issues of this book, the issues of Flint, are issues everywhere. There are kids everywhere, rural, urban, black, white, brown, that are waking up to the same nightmares as our Flint kids. Nightmares of poverty, injustice, austerity, lost democracy, discrimination, you name it. So I'm hopeful that we can make an impact in a much bigger and broader level.
Well, what was the most difficult thing about writing the book?
The most difficult thing about writing this book is, in addition to having a regular job and a family and everything, was letting go. It was absolutely letting go. I did not want to stop writing this book, and I think that speaks to, I think most doctors are kind of type A, OCD, perfectionists. So I could have continued editing forever. However, there's, like you mentioned, there's a lot of historical deep dives in there. And I just kept digging and digging and digging and digging. There's a section in there about Alice Hamilton, who's one of my heroes. She's the first female professor at Harvard. She was a University of Michigan medical school grad in the 1920s, the world's expert on lead poisoning in the 1920s. She fought Kettering and GM with all her life to make sure they didn't add lead in gasoline. She failed, but she was a badass. She was amazing. So I just read 2 books about her while doing this.
She went after Kettering.
She went after Kettering.
What did she do?
She spoke at public meetings. Yeah. She fed stories to the media. She created a broader coalition of families. She worked with Jane Addams at the Hull House and created wraparound services for kids in Chicago. She was an expert in industrial and occupational health back in the 1920s, and she's absolutely one of my role models. And I could have added a lot more stuff about her. There's also a section in there about my great uncle. So my great uncle, Nouri Raphael, left Iraq in the 1930s with a buddy. There was 2 of them that left Baghdad, and they went to Spain to fight Franco in the Spanish Civil War.
This is fantastic.
And I always knew about this as a kid growing up. I'm like, oh yeah, your great uncle Nouri like fought fascism and all this stuff. I'm like, oh, that's amazing.
This is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
He fought with the Americans in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade because he had gone to MIT, so I guess he knew a little bit of English. So they put him with the Americans.
Right. You can speak English. You can shoot.
Yeah, they couldn't really figure him out. But we didn't know much about him until we finally used his nom de guerre, his like code name, his fake name, and we were able to get his entire file from the Spanish Civil War. So during the research of this book, I got his entire file from the Spanish Civil War that was documented that he was part of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and he fought in the Battle of Ebro, which is like the very first battle of World War II, and like real combat, amazing. And then he spent the rest of his life fighting for freedom. He fought for Palestine's independence from the English, and really fought a borderless cause. It wasn't about country, right. It wasn't about race, it wasn't about religion, it was about freedom and justice.
And running from strong men.
Absolutely, yeah. and being imprisoned a lot. And,
right.
Yeah.
How many more books do you have in you? You got to have a lot more books in there. I wanted you to keep digging on that one.
Yeah, I think maybe a children's book might be next, but.
How about Nora Dellinger Johnson?
Oh, awesome. So this is another one of my favorite parts of the book. Nora Dellinger Johnson was part of the Flint sit-down strike. So who knows about the Flint sit-down strike? Somebody told me, yeah, awesome. So this is the steel-plated resilience of Flint. Flint has this incredible history, and we see it every day in the people of Flint. It bears out. So the sit-down strikes, this is also 1930s in this book. So 1937, 38, right. I think around there, yeah. In the winter, it started in the new year, right. Where workers were disobedient. And they literally sat down and occupied the car plants in Flint for 44 days, and they shut production. And they were demanding a living wage and benefits and occupational safety.
We've heard strikes many times before that, but the sit-down strike was shutting the company down.
This was epic.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to the role of an epic governor at the time. So the governor of Michigan at the time there's a lot of Michigan history too, was Frank Murphy, who is my favorite governor. Milliken is a close second.
Can we do a little Frank Murphy here? I just wanted to read something that you mentioned about Frank Murphy and then ask you a question. Frank Murphy, he wrote lines that have inspired my belief in government as a force for good. Quote, and now these are Murphy's words, the law knows no finer hour than when it cuts through formal concepts and transitory emotions to protect unpopular citizens against discrimination and persecution, end quote. On behalf of another group of unpopular citizens, he referred to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II as the, quote, legalization of racism. The first justice to ever use the word racism.
He became a Supreme Court justice after being Michigan governor.
And was the first justice to ever use the word racism in a Supreme Court opinion.
This is so timely.
He went on to employ it 7 more times before it disappeared from court opinions for 2 decades. So he was a governor. Why? Now I'll ask the obvious. Why did you love Frank Murphy?
So he called the National Guard out during the sit-down strikes, and many people thought that he was going to use it against the strikers, but he used it against General Motors. So the National Guard came out and they protected the strikers, and they were able, their union, the UAW, was born, it was recognized, and that established something called the Grand Bargain, which informed wages across the country for decades. It meant living wages, it meant benefits, it meant great schools, it meant great infrastructure, and that spread throughout the nation, and that was born in Flint. Many people argue the middle class, because of those actions, was born in Flint. And at one point, and it wasn't even too long ago, the highest per capita income was in Flint. Think about that. The highest wages in the country.
And more disposable income.
Yeah, was in Flint. And because of that, we had some of the best public health indices as well.
Right. I love the layers of history in what the eyes don't see. Let me start to merge back into to health and wellness. You said your favorite and detective work. You said my favorite sleuth is Jon Snow.
So you guys, Game of Thrones fans, Jon Snow? Yeah. So it's not that Jon Snow. It's not that Jon Snow. So Jon Snow is incredible. So 19th century London, time of the Industrial Revolution, was a time of raging cholera epidemics. And at that time, everybody believed that you got cholera from miasma, which means stinky air. So people thought that because you breathed bad, smelly air, which was rampant in London at that time, that you got this diarrheal disease. And Jon Snow was like a jack of all trades. He was an anesthesiologist. He actually gave anesthesia to Queen Victoria during childbirth. He was a physician, but he was also an epidemiologist, which meant he kind of studied populations and epidemics. And he took it on himself. He's like, I'm an anesthesiologist. I know about breathing and air and stuff. He's like, I don't think this is the reason that people are dying of cholera. So he took it, and he came from he was poor, his family were laborers, unlike most of the physicians at the time, and he never blamed the ill on their predicaments. So he blamed, he's like, maybe they got sick because they had poor lighting or poor housing conditions. So he was very much of a commoner despite being a physician. And he took it upon himself to figure out what was the cause of cholera, and he narrowed it down to a pump, a water pump, the Broad Street pump, which was contaminated with cholera. And your eyes don't see cholera, it's colorless, it's odorless, but he tracked it down, and he used amazing mapping.
He was like a zip code guy.
He was like a zip code guy. And he used incredible mapping to figure out who got sick if they drank from the pump, and for the folks that lived far away but got sick, he found out that they actually got water from that pump. So he really kind of birthed what is one of the pioneers of public health. And from then that we now have amazing, much better water sanitation, disinfection systems, and really water systems are now really the kind of basis of many civilizations.
Yeah. So have you always been a sleuth? Were you a sleuth when you were younger?
Maybe, I don't know.
I want to read another excerpt about a guy named Paul Shakwana. This is from the miasma section, which is a whole chapter about stinky air. I love stories about people who can, simply by being persistent, methodical, and dedicated, change the trajectory of a life, or even an entire population in generations to come. And what I love in particular is a good, engrossing public health mystery, perhaps because I have one in my family. The person at the center of it isn't famous like Jon Snow, but a distant cousin of mine, a bacteriologist named Paul Shakwana. Who was he?
So in the early 1900s, so a distant cousin came from Assyria. It actually says birthplace is Assyria, but present-day Iraq. He came to Washington, D.C., to George Washington University, and he was trained as an infectious disease expert, bacteriologist at the time. And right when he got to DC, he was called to Iowa City because of a public health outbreak of typhoid disease. And he spent most of his time in Iowa City and the Midwest fighting different public health issues. He had a whole lab in the Iowa City Department of Health. He even talked about the pasteurization of milk. He has an article in JAMA, which is the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is like this renowned medical journal, about the importance of hand washing. Anybody in the medical world right now, you know that it's still very difficult to get folks to wash their hands and how important it is to prevent disease. And he even had written at the time about water quality and about how we have variations in water quality and how that can impact people's health. So he came from Iraq, and he dedicated his life to the Midwest, to kind of the public health issues at the time, which were largely infectious disease at the time.
Whoa.
And I don't even know if there's any Iraqis in Iowa now. I mean, like, it's amazing to think that in like the early 1900s there were. Like, it's amazing.
He was actually here.
Yeah.
Where are some other places that you and colleagues are looking at water quality issues?
Yeah, so I think there are so many positive ripple effects of Flint, of this water crisis. And I probably spend a third of my time now talking to people in other communities that are facing similar issues. And because Flint has opened people's eyes to water quality, I mean, who didn't think that their water was okay? Like, once again, it's America, the 21st century. We have rules and laws and regulations and people who wake up to make sure that the water that we drink every day is okay. And that's despite living here in the Great Lakes, where we're surrounded by the largest source of fresh water in the world. But I think people have opened their eyes and said, hey, maybe our water's not okay where we are. So folks all over are testing and finding things like lead in water. We hear almost week after week about another school system from Newark, New Jersey, Chicago, Philadelphia that is testing and finding lead in water. Detroit Public Schools, as you know, closed their water because of lead in water. And finally, we're getting investments and we're getting funding, not enough, to be able to address these issues. And they are everywhere issues. So if we just talk about lead in water, even though we knew about the badness of lead in our plumbing, it wasn't until 1986 did we restrict lead from our service lines, which are the pipes that go from the water main to your home. But get this, not until 2014 did we restrict lead from fixtures and faucets, from brass fixtures and faucets. So Flint schools had some of the highest water lead levels. And we didn't even have any lead pipes. They were leaching out of these faucets. So they all had to be replaced with faucets and fixtures built after 2014. So this is an everywhere issue, and people are starting to pay attention. And we heard about PFAS and PFAS issues. So it's wonderful that people are paying attention, and that hopefully we'll have stronger regulations to protect our drinking water quality.
Can you spin out a little bit PFAS and PFAS issues that you've been keeping up with, just to fill us in on what the latest is? Because it seems like there's a new story every day. Yeah,
so and I'm definitely not an expert here, but this is a man-made chemical that we use as a fire retardant. It's especially was used in the military and by firefighters. To this day, it's used. It's also well known to have adverse human health effects. It causes things like low birth weight, cancers, cholesterol dysfunction, and just like many environmental health issues, it's not something you see right away. So that another reason that this book is called What the Eyes Don't See, because we don't see a kid with lead poisoning. They don't present to our office. It's asymptomatic. Lead is known as a silent pediatric epidemic, but we see the consequences years, if not decades, if not generations later. And that's common with many environmental health issues. The exposure was a long time ago. It may lead to something later, so it's difficult to diagnose, it's difficult to prevent, and it's difficult to treat. You're probably familiar with the PBB disaster in Michigan. Probably in our history, one of the other worst environmental disasters, where cattle feed for animals was mixed up with PBB, a chemical, and there's a registry for folks that were exposed that is tracking the grandchildren of those people exposed, and they're seeing things like hormone disruption. And that's common with many environmental issues. We don't know what they do, and when we do, it's often too late, and it takes painstaking research to clarify what it does. And the problem, and that gets back to how we regulate chemicals and how we govern public health. We are not governed by something called the Precautionary Principle, which means err on the side of caution.
Something might be wrong rather than...
Yeah, so we are governed by something called the Keyhole Paradigm, which is in my book, which was really established by General Motors and Kettering when they put lead in gasoline. It's more like show me the harm, and then we'll regulate it. Right. And that has been really how our nation has regulated toxins. We haven't regulated toxins, and industry has had the upper hand. And even with things like lead, where we clearly know, and science has told us there's no safe level, there's even a pushback. And imagine how much harder it is with things like PFAS, where the science isn't as clear, but we know it's dangerous. So we need to err on the side of caution.
Tell us about your work with the Flint Registry.
Yeah. So, when the crisis happened, our focus right away went to what's next. What do we need to do for especially the children? And that's where I spend my every day. And one of those things that was on our long list of recovery interventions has been the registry. We advocated for about 1.5 years to get this funded. It was finally included in the Flint bill that did pass Congress in December of 2016. The registry, people think a registry is like, oh, that's just a list, that's just long-term tracking. And that's how most registries have been in this nation. The World Trade Center registry, it's on its 17th year of tracking folks that were exposed to the World Trade Center disaster. But this is unlike any of that. So this is a grant that Michigan State got, and that we actually were designated as a public health authority, because this is not research, this is not tracking, it is action. It is about identifying folks who were exposed to this water crisis, children, adults, everybody. It's about 140,000 people, but most importantly, getting them connected to the resources and the services to not see the consequences of this crisis. So it's a massive project. We launched pre-enrollment, we launched actual enrollment later this month, and we hope that everybody enrolls. It's voluntary. Not only will it benefit individual children and families, it will benefit the city. It will tell us in a very data-driven way, how is Flint doing? But we also hope it's one of our tools where we can benefit the nation. 'Cause we hope to share some of the really innovative and awesome things that we're doing in Flint with other communities, and this will be a mechanism where we can do that.
Can we shift back to the action part of this story?
You have to read the book.
You just have to read the book. The interweaving of history and an exciting detective narrative just sticks with me. You probably thought I was really weird when I said, this kind of feels like Moby Dick to me in a way. When I first told you that, this incredible hunt, referring back to history to put things back in perspective. I know it's really weird. But I want to go back to when you first got together with Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech. Can you remind us about who, most of us know who Mark Edwards is by now, but
Sure.
I did, but take us back to when you first became aware of him and who he is.
Yeah, so Mark Edwards is a water expert. He's an environmental engineer. He's one of the world's leading experts on corrosion and lead in water. He single-handedly uncovered the lead and water crisis in Washington, D.C. Like I said, that was about a decade ago. It had lasted longer than Flint. The levels were even worse than Flint. And there was a massive government cover-up of that lead and water disaster. And to this day, nobody has been held accountable. So he has gone around the nation trying to kind of expose lead and water issues and ultimately to protect children. So he was involved in Flint much before I was. He had been contacted by an amazing mom named Leanne Walters, and had been kind of clued in from his friend at the EPA, Miguel Del Toro. So when he found out from this mom in Flint that the water wasn't being treated properly, that the state wasn't doing anything about it, he literally packed his minivan overnight with graduate students and with supplies, and he drove up from Blacksburg, Virginia, which is in the middle of nowhere, to Flint to work with the citizens of Flint to prove that there was lead in the water. And they sampled in a very scientific way the entire city. They took water samples, and very transparently, they didn't wait to publish their results, very transparently on his website, they showed elevated levels of lead in the water throughout the city of Flint, in the hundreds and thousands, and hazardous waste levels of lead in water. There's no safe level of lead in water, but we were seeing levels from his samples. And Leanne's house, I think, was about 13,000 parts per billion. It's 5,000 is hazardous waste sample. And he was sharing this very publicly, and he was also being attacked by the state. They said he was like a magician, that he would just pull rabbits out of hats. You know, wherever he would go, he would find lead in water. So his clear-cut science was being dismissed. And he was a MacArthur genius. Like this guy was brilliant. It's not somebody you want to mess with.
But he wore a panda tie.
He wore a panda tie, So my friend Elin.
Many layers.
Many layers. So my friend Elin happens to also be a Virginia Tech alum. She's an environmental engineer. Okay. She lives in the same world that he does, which is this drinking water world. And she was warning me. She's like, Mona, everybody in the drinking water world is afraid of him. Like he calls people out. If somebody attacks him, he attacks them. Yeah. And his only quest is truth and science, and he'll do anything. And he knows how to FOIA. I'm like, what's FOIA? She's like, when you submit a Freedom of Information Act, like he'll go after the truth and find out. And she's like, and I'm like, well, I think we should reach out to him. Like he's in Flint. He's a scientist. He's working with people. He's trying to uncover the truth. He found lead in the water. Like, don't you think we should meet with him? She's like, no, we shouldn't meet with him. I'm like, no, I think we should meet with him. So in the book, so I'm like, I gotta find out who this guy is. Like, why is he so scary? Why is everybody scared of him? Like, he went after the CDC and the EPA and DC water, and he eventually won. We need him at our side because we need allies. So I Googled him. I'm like, Mark Edwards, let me find out who this guy is. And it pulled up that he had won this MacArthur Genius Award, which is this amazing recognition for his
huge prize to do work.
Yeah. With lots of dollars attached to it. It helped cover his costs of fighting the DC issue. And I pulled up this picture, and here's this guy with this terrible tie, like this panda tie, and it's in the book, and these sad-looking pandas, and I'm like, this is the guy that everybody's scared of. So we met for lunch. I'm like, I'm meeting him. We need him at our side. And we met for lunch, and literally after a minute of meeting him.
You said there was a look at the table between you and Elin.
Yeah, so, he was coming back into town to do some testing, and I'm like, can we meet for lunch? Yeah. And Elin's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I need to meet him. I need to know if he's for real. And we sat, and literally, like I said, it took a minute or two to realize that here is a guy from, far away, thousands of miles away, in a different profession than I am. A tall white guy, couldn't be more different. Like literally, I think his ancestors came on the Mayflower. Who votes different than me, who acts different than me, who cared about kids probably more than I cared about kids. And it took a second to realize that. And that is one of the big lessons of this book and this story, is that we need to get out of our bubbles and out of our silos and work with folks who are different than us. And we think that we're alone so often in these fights, but there's people just like us, or who care about things just as much as we do, and we don't realize that.
I thought that was an incredible moment of excitement and intention. And now I'm seeing flashing lights, so I don't think there's anything wrong, but that's the signal to stop.
Oh, okay. I'm like, are you okay? Do you need a doctor?
No, I'm all right.
Okay.
No, I was warned about that. I thought, I'm seeing flashing lights. I'm in a good spot.
Great. I take care of kids,
because,
but it's okay.
I think you could help. But I was pre-warned that we must stop at some point, regretfully. But read the book. It's incredible. Thank you. Thank you so
Peter.
much.
Thank you. You're awesome.
Great.
Don't leave. Now we get to hear from you. So this is a time for us to hear from you for questions. And there's folks with mics all over, I think.
Where to look for microphones? There's one. Recognize that. We're going to go over that way. Here we go. That guy has a
Dr.
mic.
Mona, when I read your book, one of the things that really struck me is that you recognize that for decades, this has been an issue with the state and with cities in Michigan. And I just thought that, even though you said it, it was a colossal understatement. I mean, this goes back to Governor Engler with making his tax cuts
Absolutely.
and single-handedly targeting certain individuals that got laid off. One of whom, his next job was to become a professor at Michigan State University. But I know these individuals from my standpoint. I'm absolutely convinced that had they still been with the DEQ and the Department of Public Health, Flint would not have happened.
Yeah. So I talk about the book. I talk about the real villains of this crisis, and I think it's easier for us to like name people. Oh, it's this person's fault. It's the emergency manager's fault. This much fault. But the real villains are the villains of austerity. We have been cutting and starving cities since the early 1990s. We have been starving these amazing departments, our health departments, our DEQ. We've been making sure experts leave to save dollars. The villains are austerity. The villains are racism, long-standing issues of racism. The villains are capitalism. There's so many of these villains that are the real villains of the story, even more so than any of these people. And Flint has been, and I talk about this, so Flint has been, this was a crisis on top of decades of crisis. Flint has been in crisis way before this. You know this. We talked about Flint's heyday having the highest per capita income, but then we had, you just watch Roger and me, you know the story. So, I mean, then we suffered from years of disinvestment and an unemployment and poverty and clear racism that made the city what it was, and lack of imagination and population loss and crumbling schools and decline of unions. So many of these crises got to Flint to where it was. And put us in this emergency management situation. We didn't talk about emergency management. This is a crisis of democracy. Flint literally had democracy taken away from it. And at one point, this needs to be reiterated, at one point in Michigan, 50% of African Americans in the state were under emergency management, compared to 2% of our white population. As a state, we voted down the emergency manager law, and the legislation put it back in, and Governor Snyder signed it again. So this is anti-democracy. People's voices were not at the table. But this is not just a Flint issue. It's not just a Michigan issue, because this is why this is a story that's bigger than Flint, because we are seeing examples and examples of democracy being taken away from voter suppression, gerrymandering, mass incarceration. All of these are purposeful efforts to take away people, electoral college, to take away people's right to be at the table.
Hi, Dr. Mona. I just had a brief comment for you. If you had any doubts that Traverse City just loves you, as every other community I'm sure that you go to, I was at the opening night of Fahrenheit 11/9, and the minute you showed on screen, there was a round eruption of applause for you.
Thank you. You guys are awesome.
And on a personal
Best
note,
city ever, seriously.
on a personal note, I went to University of Michigan, the Flint campus, as my undergrad, and then I went to Michigan State for my master's.
Awesome.
So, yes.
I bleed all
Thank you.
colors. It's all great. It's all
Thank
good.
you.
That's what makes Michigan strong. Yay, one of our high school students.
Hello.
Hey, Joe.
I was just kind of wondering, how did you get your story out there? How did you get your story to the ears of the nation? Like, I mean, with all the suppression that the government did, how did you get that out there?
So when I did this research that showed that children were in harm's way, that they had more lead in their blood after we switched water sources. I did something that doctors are not supposed to do, that academics are not supposed to do. I'm sure there's academics. So what do you do when you have research? How do you share your research? Peer review process. How long does that take? Years. It takes a long time, months if not a really long time to share your research. So I literally walked out of my clinic and I walked into a press conference to share this research. And this was a form of academic disobedience. So I think the best accolade that I ever got was an award from MIT called the Disobedience Award. Like, how awesome is that? It's so awesome. Very awesome. But very difficult to explain to my children that I got a disobedience award because they need to do their homework and go to bed. So I went into that public stage. So I spoke up at a press conference full of media and shared that children were in harm's way and that we needed to take action. And it was that moment in the water crisis, and there's been kind of many investigations of the media's involvement in the water crisis. That was the peak of that was the beginning peak. It then peaked even more later. But that's when national media started to pay attention. And it never should have gotten to the point that we had to prove evidence of harm in children. It should have stopped when that first mom held a jug of brown water and said something's wrong with my child. It never should have gotten to that far. So there's been a lot of analysis of like the role of media in this story, and media has played an incredible role. So ultimately, like, it was our science that spoke truth to power, but with the support of media really kind of starting to pay attention and creating this national embarrassment for our state.
We go in the back.
One of the statements you made earlier kind of surprised me. You said that had they added the corrosive control to the water, that it would have been okay. My understanding is the people that died of Legionnaires' disease, which was more than a dozen, perhaps many more than that, would have still died had it not, that it had no connection to the corrosive thing. But that wasn't my question. My wife and I both grew up in Flint, and I used to work for the water department, and I used to work at Hurley Hospital. My question is, after spending tens of millions of dollars, I still don't know who made the decision to make those people drink that water.
Yeah. So we'll go to the Legionnaires' disease. So we had one of the largest outbreaks of Legionnaires' disease. Over 12 people died. There was also an increase in overall pneumonia mortality, which people think was undiagnosed Legionnaires' disease. The reason that we had more Legionnaires' disease was because of the corrosivity of the water. So not only did we have lead leaching out of lead plumbing, we had iron reaching out of iron pipes. That's why we had the brown water. That was the iron. Lead in water is invisible, what the eyes don't see. But the iron in the water, it eats up your disinfectant. It ate up the chlorine. And then that iron in the water also served as a perfect overgrowth for opportunistic pathogens like Legionnaires' disease, like Legionella. So it was because of the corrosivity of the water. Mark Edwards actually came to Flint looking for Legionnaires' disease. So he predicted it to be there. That's one of the reasons he actually came to find it. And that is why we now have homicide charges, negligent homicide charges against many of the officials because of those deaths related to the Legionnaires' disease. So whose fault was this? I don't know. And there's many investigations, there's many charges. This is an ongoing story. This is not history. And I hope that more of the who knew what and when comes to light. Most of the investigations thus far have put the blame at the feet of the Office of Drinking Water in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. That's where most of the investigations thus far have put the majority of the blame. They knew that it was supposed to be treated. With the corrosion control, they're the ones that didn't do it. Even when EPA told them you need to treat this properly, they still did not. So that corrosion control chemical, it turns out, only would have cost $80 to $100 a day. So it wasn't a cost issue. The pump to install that chemical was never even installed.
We're going to go back here.
Dr. Mona, welcome back to Traverse City from Michigan Writers. We have a lot of writers in the audience who want to take a nonfiction issue that affects all of us and write about it. Can you say a little bit about inspiring folks to do just that?
Yeah, so it's a lot of work to write a book. But it is, I would absolutely do it all over again. To be able to share a story to a wider audience is priceless. And I think we need more and more nonfiction stories out there to be told by authentic, genuine voices about issues that people think are important to them. But it has to be done with passion. So this was absolutely a labor of love. And really all work that anybody does has to be done with passion, because then it's not work, then it's something that serves a higher purpose. So keep at it. It's not easy. I think my path to writing this book was anomalous. It was, I was blessed with an amazing editor and a publisher. Penguin Random House, my publisher, was all in for the story. Not only obviously with publishing this book, a lot of our work in Flint around the recovery is everything we're doing is about improving children's development. A lot of that lives around the world of early literacy. Great shout out to Battle of the Books. But a lot of our work is about getting more hands in the books of Flint kids. We have now in place, because of our work, every kid in Flint now gets a book mailed to them every month from the age of 0 to 5. We have things like Reach Out and Read and Born to Read, but also the publisher has donated about 5,000 children's books. So they have been really invested in this story. My editor is an amazing guy named Chris Jackson. He is the editor of Brian Stevenson, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Trevor Noah, and he is committed to elevating diverse voices and to social justice issues. And I just feel like I just cannot believe that I get to work with these incredible people. So I would just say keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. But I also understand that kind of my path to writing this book was very fortunate and privileged and blessed.
We have a question up here.
Two more questions. Thank you.
Two more questions.
Dr. Mona, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for coming to take the time to speak with us. It's hugely appreciated.
I came for the cherries. We already went to Cherry Republic.
I'm a registered nurse at Munson here in Traverse City,
Awesome.
speaking as both a... Speaking as both a healthcare professional and a resident of Michigan, what can we do to get involved? Obviously, there are a huge number of crises still going on, so what can we do on an individual or a local community level?
Sure. So if you want to help Flint, you can donate to flintkids.org. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to give back. Part of the proceeds go to flintkids.org, which is funding all of these child development promoting interventions, our literacy programs, breastfeeding, nutrition education, home visiting, what have you. But the lesson of this book is that you don't have to come to Flint. You don't have to help Flint. It's about what the eyes don't see is about people, places, and problems everywhere that we choose not to see. They're right outside our front door. But it is about the role that we all have to open our eyes and each other's eyes to these problems. But it's not enough to be awake. We have to act. We have to take action. We have to become civically engaged. We have to vote. We have to run for office. You have to do any of these things. Find something. And once again, you have to find something you're passionate about. If you're passionate about water, then that's your passion. If you're passionate about homelessness, just find something and use your competence and your confidence to make your little world a better place.
One more. The microphone. There we go. Thank you. Sir.
Dr. Mona, about 6, maybe 9 months ago, I got an email from Gretchen Whitmer's campaign headquarters, and it informed me that the Schneider administration had stopped free water bottle distribution in Flint. I wrote a letter to the governor, and I asked him why I hadn't read that on the headlines in a press release from his office, and that I was skeptical about whether the crisis was actually solved. To my amazement, I got an answer back that read like an academic treatise for somebody who was a water quality expert, which I am not. I'm just a retired Army colonel. I don't know squat.
You're awesome.
But I'm still skeptical, and I'm wondering Is the water in Flint safe enough today that we don't need to be distributing free bottled water? And what about all those lead connections from the service line to the houses in Flint?
Yeah. So the same week that the state ended bottled water supply to Flint, they also gave Nestle their permit for unlimited access, essentially, for $200 a year for Great Lakes water. And to this day, we have people in Flint who still can't pay for their water. We have shutoffs to this day of people who cannot afford their water. Before we were a crisis of quality, we were a crisis of affordability. Flint at one point was paying the highest water rates in the country, and that has not much changed. So where are we in terms of our water? So Flint is still under a public health emergency. The advisory by our health department is that people still need to be on filtered and bottled water until our pipes are replaced. So Flint is embarking on an amazing project. We are replacing our lead pipes. There are only 2 other cities in this nation that have replaced their lead pipes, Lansing, Michigan, and Madison, Wisconsin. That's it. And Flint will be the 3rd. When you do infrastructure work, earth-moving work, and which we are doing in a massive citywide way, that disrupts the lead scale that's underneath, and it increases the risk of lead release. And that is why the advisory is that people need to continue to be on bottled water until the pipes will be replaced, which will happen by 2020, end of 2019, which is ahead of schedule, which is faster than any other city has done it. So that's why the recommendation is still in place. So not only was it helping with the quality issues, but like I said, the bottled water was really helping with people's affordability issues because they still can't pay for their water. I think we're no more questions allowed.
Maybe one more.
One more.
One more.
I'm a resident of Flint. Thank you, Dr. Mona, for...
Thank you. These are the real heroes. These are the real heroes.
I want to thank you for a couple things. My husband's also was a first grade teacher in Flint Community Schools, and he has seen directly what our crisis has caused for these young children. Thank you for writing this book, because I feel like we've been... It was in the news, everybody was talking about it, and it's kind of calmed down a little bit. Mm-hmm. And for me, this book kind of brings more hope for our city. So I want to thank you on multiple levels. Also, we were discussing up here, who was the major pushback when you started this whole process of trying to get the word out that we have been poisoned?
Sure. So the major pushback, so after I did this press conference where I released this research, really every arm of the state came out and attacked me. The governor's office, the DEQ spokesperson, and from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Every line, they said I was wrong, that I was unfortunate, that I was causing near hysteria, which is sexist, and that I was splicing and dicing numbers, and that their data, and they had this data, and through FOIA, we realized they didn't even looked at this data before, but they said that they had this data, and that my research was not consistent with their research. So not only were they attacking the science, but also my credibility. So every arm of the state. And you'll read that all in the book. It's all in there. Thank you.
Thank you for inspiring us to keep working.
Thank you.